I want to welcome everybody. On behalf of the faculty at the College of Professional Studies Master of Science in Organizational Leadership Program, I would like to welcome you to this year's third and final Leadership Matters webinar. My name is Les Stein. I know some of you and would hope to meet all of you at some point. And I want to thank my colleagues, Dr. Teresa Good, Dr. Nancy Paulushin, Dr. Sriram Rajagopalan, and for their work in organizing these webinars. We've been doing these webinars for the last 2 years. It's worked out very well, and we've had some great folks talking about leadership, our favorite subject, and it's just something that I think is very important. I would like to please note that the presentation will be recorded, and we welcome all of your questions and comments. Please put them in the chat box. I will focus on them first when we ask our speaker today, when we have questions, it's time for questions. And so please don't hesitate to do that. We will be monitoring the chat box throughout. I don't have to tell any of you, I hope, that our nation has been challenged since its inception, as a matter of fact, by social justice. It's unfortunate that after almost 250 years as a democracy, we're still struggling with making this issue a reality. On the surface, it seems like a simple problem. Everyone should treat each other as an equal and with the same level of dignity and respect. Unfortunately, those words are far easier said than done. One thing, however, is very clear, at least to me. When we have the right leaders in government, industry, and every other part of our social system, we begin to see some positive results. Our guest today, Dr. Richard O'Brien, comes from a family that has made it their life's work to address and find solutions to the many problems associated with social justice. And that is what we are here to discuss. Dr. O'Brien is director of the John D. O'Brien African American Institute at Northeastern University, named in remembrance of his father. And I strongly encourage you to review the Institute's website so you can fully appreciate the work being accomplished in areas that include academic components, community outreach efforts, connecting with Northeastern's Black alumni, and the many other initiatives that are part of this institute. Dr. O'Brien also serves as a lecturer in the Department of Political Science, the School of Public Policy and Urban Affairs, and our very own Master of Science in Organizational Leadership Program, where he teaches introductory leadership program, and will be teaching some others in the very near future. Dr. O'Brien was awarded his PhD from Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and he has a very strong publication record. Richard, it is my absolute pleasure to welcome you and thank you for joining us. Our discussion today is about the role of leadership in achieving social justice. Richard, the floor is all yours.
Well, thank you, Les, for that kind and warm introduction. I didn't realize you were going to say all that, but I appreciate it. Good afternoon, everybody. As Les mentioned, I am Richard O'Brien, and lecturer in our organizational leadership program, as well as director of the John D. O'Brien African American Institute. I'm pleased to have this opportunity to talk with you about the role of leadership in achieving social justice. I will first talk about social justice movements and why they occur. I will share some examples of major social movements, particularly those inspired by students. And finally, I'll talk about specific student-led social justice movements that here on campus. I do plan to leave time for questions and answers, but during my talk, feel free to post your questions in the chat. So I'd first like to start out with 2 laws of physics that applies to social justice movements. Does anybody know what this formula is? It's okay if you don't. It's a formula for inertia. It's product of mass and velocity. The definition is that a body at rest will remain at rest, and a body in motion will remain in motion until acted on by an outside force. The formula for force is mass times acceleration. If you think about how movements have happened over the years, it's always some incident or some occurrence that causes social change to occur. I want you to hold these two laws and concepts in your mind as we journey through this discussion about social justice movement. Oftentimes, what occurs prior to social justice movements is, as I mentioned, there tends to be some incident or some situation that can affect what we all see as the status quo, or when an organization is in a state of inertia. If you look at some of the major social justice movements since the 60s, it was and is usually in response to some event that occurs, and people want to change the situation or the circumstances. What is most apparent is that the major social movements in recent history were and are inspired by students. As you can see from these well-known social justice movements around the world, that students played a critical role in bringing these movements to the world's attention. I won't go through describing each of these movements, as you can Google them and read about them and the societal impact they had. I'm highlighting the university uprisings because I'm going to come back to that in just a moment. As many of us know, Nordhaus has been researching and defining leadership for many years. At a point, he had defined it as a process whereby an individual influences a group of individuals to achieve a common goal. When I talk with students and work with students about becoming leaders, I always encourage them to be the type of leaders that transform, that serve, that collaborate, and be an example of good ethical leadership. This helps to set a context for the next part of my presentation. As was mentioned, my day job, as I like to call it, is being the director of the John D. O'Brien African American Institute. As Les mentioned, is named after my dad. The Institute, as it is endearingly called, was started in more than 50 years ago and is rooted in how much Northeastern has changed over the years. Northeastern University and in its early years, as you know, was focused on working class folks that wanted to go to school, and it struggled with issues of diversities even back then. As we all know, the 60s and the 70s was a very difficult time for our country. And it was difficult a time for our college campuses. And it all seemed to culminate from the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King in 1968. Most college campuses were disrupted. Students, Black and white, decided they wanted to make a change. And so it was on Northeastern's campus. The Institute was founded in 1968. The reason why I had you all keep the words inertia and force in mind, because what can happen to an organization is it gets into a mode of operation. And unless somebody does something, it won't change, or it will remain in a state of inertia and will continue to do what it does until somebody decides that they really want to change it. So in 1968, like all the other college campuses, Northeastern had Black students rise up and demand that the university pay attention to them, make some changes to help accommodate them, and to make it a safe place for them as students. In 1968, a group of students got together on Northeastern's campus and issued 13 demands to the university. Now, the reason why it's important is because those 13 demands were never fully met. So they asked for things like more scholarships. They wanted 10% of the incoming class to be Black. They wanted more summer orientation programs to support more students coming to Northeastern. They wanted to develop a Black Studies program. They wanted to develop student organizations that could represent them and advocate for them. They wanted to improve Black student retention, and they wanted to get support for the community through service opportunities. All this was in 1968. Fast forward to 2020. Like the event that happened in 1968, the killing of George Floyd ended up being another one of those moments in our history. And not all of the college campuses, but many college campuses went into activation mode. They went into organizing mode. They went into protesting mode. And so it was with our Northeastern students. As a matter of fact, the whole country was in protest mode. The massive public demonstrations we all saw during that time period. But what happened on our campus was students came together, organized themselves, and wanted to talk to the administration about what they were going to do to make things change on this campus. And what the students intelligently did was they pulled out the original 13 demands from 1968. And in this picture, you see we're having a conversation with President Ayoun, and they were asking the question, why haven't these demands ever been fully met? At this time in 2020, since 1968, the 10% of the incoming class demand was never met. Since 1968, the summer orientation and support programs was never met. Since 1968, there was not close attention paid to retention. So the students were savvy enough, they were smart enough to raise the fact that many of these demands were never addressed. And to President Ayoun's credit, he listened. He listened. The chancellor listened, the provost listened, the students were speaking to whoever in the administration that would listen. Many of the student organizations got together and demanded that the university make some changes. And again, to the credit of Northeastern, they listened. At that time, though, it was in a state of inertia. And so all of these issues came to light and came to head. But all that was about to change. For some reason, 2020 changed everything. Now, granted, there was a movement throughout the country, so the momentum was there, the energy was there. Shortly after these meetings with the students, President Ayoun issued a statement stating that this is what the university is going to do. Now, mind you, at this point, President Ayoun had been president for about 12 or 13 years. I have been here at Northeastern about the same amount of time, maybe a little bit longer. President Ayoun is very careful about making these kinds of public commitments. But he felt that the administration had to make an important and bold statement with regards to what the university was planning to do around these issues. The spirit of what the students had been asking was if the university was going to be serious about making some changes and diversity on this campus, it needed to start with students coming in the door. And also in 2021, for the first time, the incoming class was now more than 10% Black. Students demanded more faculty of color. They got more faculty of color. Students demanded more support services like summer programs and Summer Bridge, which was originally just an engineering summer program. The university extended it and made it a campus-wide Summer Bridge leadership program. So all of the colleges participate. Students wanted to make sure that more resources were available to help them stay and for them to be able to be retained. Now, granted, statistics show the most common reason students leave is usually after the first year. And it's not necessarily money. It's not necessarily academics. It's feelings of isolation and feelings of alienation. But what students believe is if they could increase the total number of Black students on campus, the issue would take care of itself because students would feel less isolated and feel more a part of the community and feel less alienated. In my conclusion, as a result of all that was happening during that time, I want to say since 1968, but I can't say for certain, that when students made demands in 1968, that they saw Northeastern becoming what it is today. But a big reason why you see the activity that was happening in 2020 and 2021 was because of so many good and well-meaning faculty, staff, and students and administrators on our campus. I can tell you right now, in 1968, if we told students then that Northeastern would make Juneteenth a holiday, I can tell you right now, they would have said, yeah, you're right. Right. You're crazy. You know that that would never happen here at Northeastern. Dr. Carl Reed's position as Northeastern's Chief Inclusion Officer was a direct result of what the students did in their demands in 2020. In 2021, Dr. Reed championed the cause, and that year was the first time Northeastern agreed to celebrate Juneteenth, being a recognized holiday on campus. The graduating class that year was special because they represented, yes, a return from the pandemic and being able to participate in person, but it also was a transition for those student leaders that had done so much in their efforts to help change Northeastern. Ultimately, in our roles here, our collective roles here at the university, our goal is to help students stay here, to help students learn, and for them to be able to graduate and to become tomorrow's leaders and the change makers that we want them to be. The movements that we have seen over the years that have been led by students have obviously impacted not just the college campuses, but have impacted society in general. And they continue to this day. And I look forward to getting a chance to discuss all of these things in more detail with you. But I just want to say that, and I say this to our students all the time, that they are tomorrow's leaders and that we are helping them prepare today. So I'll take questions.
Thank you, Richard. That was great. I really appreciate that. It was great background information as well. And I knew a lot of that, of course. I mean, having read so many of the material that's out there, but at the same time, you really kind of put this in your focus. The focus was really good, and it's in perspective. And I wonder if I could. Let me ask you. Let me just start, and I want to encourage everybody to please on the chat box, just put your questions in there. Let's get some dialogue here, because I think that's really the key to this whole thing, and that's the key to leadership, by the way, is that we open up that discussion. So a lot of the things you said just really kind of hit me, and they did. They came to me from a variety of different directions, I guess. And I grew up with Martin Luther King, with Dr. King, and his message, and the way he there are a few people that I've studied in some detail. Dr. King is one of them, because his leadership style, his skills were unbelievable. When you first identified Nordhaus and influence, I just don't know anyone that has greater influence than Dr. King, other than if we go back in history to people like George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, and a couple others that I could say at that level. But now, Richard, let's get down to the bottom line here.
Yeah,
you have a movement like the students who are saying, okay, we want to get back to those demands that we identified, in '68. There's got to be somebody. There's got to be someone who sets the tone for a group like that, because obviously masses of people can't lead themselves. They need to have somebody. Based on the studies that you've done and having observed, of course, your dad and other, what is the skill that you find most common, or maybe 2 or 3 skills that you find most common, that individuals like your father and like Dr. King and the rest of them, Ralph Abernathy, for instance, I remember watching him, and he was just, he followed Dr. King, but he had a strong persona as well. I remember watching him. What is that one skill or couple of skills that you think we need to develop in people in order to be able to get them to mobilize, get that inertia going, as you said earlier?
Yeah. Relationships. People have to have the ability to convene folks to really get a movement to get started. One of the things that Dr. King was amazing at was balancing the interests of the people he was trying to advocate for with the interests of what the country was really supposed to be, and that they didn't have to be mutually exclusive. Can you hear me? Oh, okay.
Yes, go ahead.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay.
Shannon just joined us. That's great.
And so I one of the things that happened during this process with the students here on campus is we organized these biweekly meetings with the student leaders, and what emerges out of those processes often is you'll find some who are more interested or more enthusiastic about getting out there and being involved, and there's some who don't necessarily want to be out in front, but they want to be a part of what's going on. And you got to create a space for them to be able to feel like they can all contribute no matter how much they want to be involved and want to be engaged. And so some of the students that you saw who were meeting with the president, those were students who were interested in being out there and being able to talk directly to the president, but not everybody wanted to be able to do that. And so, there's got to be a process of really helping folks who want to be involved be comfortable with how much they want to be involved and the level they want to be involved. And then second is those relationships that they had with each other, we try to support and nourish and foster so that the what they're trying to do continues to grow, because they can't do it by themselves. Obviously, no social movement ever happens by itself. If you think about the civil rights movement, what Dr. King was able to do masterfully was, as you mentioned, get other people involved who may not necessarily wanted to be out there in front, but they were supportive of the cause and wanted to be able to make an impact, even if they didn't have to be out there in front.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I would just, everything you said, I'm 100% with you. And I would add one little piece to it is that if you study the relationship between, for instance, Dr. King and Lyndon Baines Johnson,
yes,
that was a one-for-one relationship. Of course, Johnson was a masterful leader to begin with because, he was a former senator who had, he almost led by a whip. He led the U.S. Senate very often that way, and they were afraid of him in many ways. But the point is, Dr. King was able to get to him in a way that would make him realize that Johnson realized that something needed to change.
Yes.
And that's phenomenal to me because Johnson came from Texas. He came from a beginning that was not necessarily, hey, we're all equal. And all of a sudden he changed, and he changed, I think, in large part because the influence that King had on Johnson was, for me, unbelievable.
Yeah.
But anyway, I just a thought about that.
Yeah, and I'll answer the raised hand in just a second, but I want to give you some more context to the work we were doing with President Ayoun. When we first started out with the students, they didn't think he was going to respond positively. And so it took a little bit of time. And as a convener, you sort of feel like you're a Secretary of State where you're talking to two different groups that, may want to be at each other, but you want to make sure that they can come together on some mutual ground and mutual understanding. And so as administrators, that's what we were able to do, because at that time, understandably, folks were pretty upset. They were pretty angry. There was a lot of anxiety, and I can only imagine the same thing was happening in the 60s, right? That people were really not sure about who to trust.
Yeah.
And so in that process, you got to have people who can bridge that gap, right? But both sides trust. And so President Ayoun had faith and confidence in us, the administrators that were working with them. The students, we had already developed a lot of trust with them. And so when we brought them together, it was able to work, even though there was a lot of high anxiety involved.
Makes sense. We have a question, Richard, in the chat box, and I'd like to get to that. What are some common misconceptions or myths about social justice leadership, and how would you debunk them based on your experiences? And the question goes on, it says, what I mean by misconceptions is, for example, if social justice leadership is solely the responsibility of designated leaders or activists, or social justice leadership is only about advocating for marginalized groups, how would I be able to debunk that?
Let's think about the Vietnam War, right? Some of the people who protested the Vietnam War, they were not marginalized communities. They were not poor, disenfranchised communities. You had people of all socioeconomic spectrum. Same thing with the civil rights movement. There were people involved with the civil rights movement who were very well off. Harry Belafonte, who just passed away, right? He didn't need to be involved in the civil rights movement, right? And so often it's interpreted as though it's only about the interest of the disenfranchised, it's only about the interest of the poor, and that there are people out there, regardless of their status in life, who want to help make a change. And oftentimes people think that the leadership of these organizations are just angry and they're just looking for a fight, and that they're seeking to destroy the country, right? The Black Lives Matter movement went through this, right? The suggestion that they want to destroy the country, they want to bring the country down, when in actuality, people just want to get to some semblance of balance and semblance of equity where people can feel like they're being treated fairly, right? That the interest of the country and the interest of the social movement are not mutually exclusive, right? They can be one and the same if people look at it the right way. And oftentimes, and again, the Black Lives Matter movement experienced some of this. The media coverage of it is such where they capture or characterize the movement based on certain individuals that say certain things, and they use that to define the movement. And nothing could be further from the truth, you know. Congressman Claiborne, when the whole defund the police talk came out, he was extremely upset. But he said during the 60s in the civil rights movement, they had similar attempts to redefine the narrative of what the movement was all about. And he saw that the defund the police as an opportunity to try and change the narrative about what the movement was all about. And so, and to answer the question about debunking it, the way that we debunk it is we got to talk to the people and understand what are they really interested in accomplishing, right? They're not in the Black Lives Movement took on the appearance that it wanted to burn down cities, right? Now, granted, that happened in some of the movements in the past, so I can understand why people are thinking, well, that's all they want to do. They just want to destroy the cities. But that's just a small subset of the movement. And so being able to engage and talk and communicate with those who really are sincerely trying to make some social change is the approach that I think we got to take.
That's great. Yeah, that's a good answer. Thank you, Gunther. That was a great question. Glad we're able to address that. We have one from our very own Shriram, who says, if people develop relationships within their own groups, appreciation for social justice doesn't emerge as much. So what strategies should individuals adopt to build such an inclusive mindset in their own minds first?
You know, I was at the graduation for Roxbury Community College, and we had as our guest speaker, he's called a chancellor, but he's the superintendent of New York Public Schools. That's not his title, but that's the way I'm able to characterize it. So when he was speaking, he said, I forgot the number he said of the number of students in the New York City school system, but he said when he talks to students, he tells them, in order to be a global citizen, you can't have a neighborhood mindset, right? And you trying to help people understand that they are a part of a much bigger picture is really key. And you know, Dr. King was very masterful at helping people who were just fighting for peace on their block or peace in their neighborhood, that the whole world was watching, and that they're a part of this larger global community. And it's not an easy thing to get people to change their mindset, because if local is all they know, or neighborhood is all they know, or they've never traveled outside. And I can't tell you how many times I've come across students who come to Northeastern and it's the first time they've ever left their state. And then talk to them about getting into dialogue abroad, or doing an internship abroad, or study abroad. They're petrified about doing that because they've never been outside of their neighborhood and they just come into the university. And so trying to talk to them, help them understand, connect them with students who have had similar experiences so that they can help them understand that, yes, you can travel abroad and you'll be all right. You won't have any problems. But trying to help to develop that comfort level with being able to move outside of your comfort zone. And so it is with social movements, right? When you realize that something emerges like Black Lives Matter out of very painful situations and very painful experiences, once people get past that pain, or at least the pain calms down, you want to get to understanding of, okay, what do we really want to change, right? What do we really want to impact? What is really the problem? You know, the George Floyd situation really helped us understand the challenges that police and law enforcement have in policing these communities, right? It came across, and it was rightfully so, that the police were obviously very outside of their training and protocols for how they should handle. But it raised all the questions with regards to, well, what kind of training are these police getting, right? And who's running these police departments that you have officers that are behaving like this? And it shines the light on it, you know, and I think it's healthy, even though there was resistance to it, to understand what does good policing look like and what does bad policing look like. And people have been, and we're still dealing with it today, with regards to what do we think good policing should be. And hopefully we'll get there. I mean, it's a slow process. But I always, as I tell students all the time, the work that you do now and the impact that you have and the movements that you are involved with now are not for your benefit. It's for the generations coming behind you.
Excellent. Yeah, that very good. And there's something you said throughout, and this is great, Richard. Thank you very much. I mean, I'm just having a blast here. I don't know about everybody else, but something you said earlier also just clicked in my mind is that, and I want to go to Stephanie's question. She's got a good one here, but and then Katie. But what you said, Black Lives Matter. I think when we finally get to that mindset, that yes, this is about Black lives in this particular sequence of especially what's been happening. We've been doing it for 200 plus odd years in this country. But when we finally come to the realization that it's not only Black lives, it's the Asian lives that we've had issues with recently, it's the Jews in the world, it's the Muslims in the world, when everybody can understand that the Black Lives Matter is really making everybody realize that, hey, yes, it's focused on a specific group, but it's a bigger issue. And when we finally kind of break through that and understand that, you know, it's not just one, it's collectively that part about let's learn to treat each other with dignity and respect across the spectrum. Doesn't matter what you look like, what your color is, what anything is. I think that's when, and that's what hopefully this is developing into, is a bigger picture, a bigger issue.
Oh yeah, and having studied Dr. King and learned more about him every day, which is amazing after all this time he's been gone. I can only imagine that Dr. King would ask the question, why do we have to ask this question?
Right.
About whether or not somebody's life matters, right?
Exactly.
So we're raising these issues about these different groups mattering because somebody thinks they don't matter. Or at least everybody, at least they feel like, right? And that's what emerged from all this, particularly for the Black community, is like, well, does our life matter? right? That a police officer would sit with his knee on my neck, and he knows
that's right.
that I'm in trouble, that I'm hurting, and not have any compassion, and just allow the life to go out from under him like that. You know,
that's so obvious. Yeah, it seems so obvious, and yet for some people, it hasn't been obvious from the time they saw the light for the first time. But anyway, Stephanie asked a question here. She says, "Thank you so much, Richard, for the words of wisdom. Richard, in Toronto, we have also been meeting with student leaders, empowering them to start student groups to build community. How do we continue to center student voices in these discussions of social justice in the university setting?"
I'll share an interesting story with you. This happened at a Dr. King event of all places. One of the student leaders at that time, this was long before what happened with George Floyd, the university was raising the tuition, the cost of tuition, right? And for college campuses, that's like a trigger, right? Raising the cost of going to school. So one of the student leaders got up during the question and answer session, which I don't know if President Ayoun even does this anymore. And he walks to the microphone and starts to ask President Ayoun about, why are you raising tuition? And you know what you're going to do? You're going to prevent all these other students from coming to school here and blah, 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 blah. And, you know, President Ayoun handled it gracefully, but he was one of our student leaders. And so I went to talk to him one day when we were both back in the Institute. And I said to him, you know, sometimes you can try to do the right thing, but say it the wrong way, you know? And I said, when you want to present your concerns, sometimes the way you present it can either invite people in or it can push people away. And I said, the challenge that you're going to have now, the president heard you, but I don't know that he's going to respond positively because of the setting and the way that it was done, you know? And he said, well, Dr. O'Brien, what would you suggest that I do? I said, you know what? I don't know. I said, but why don't we do this? Why don't we get together with some of your other student leader colleagues, right? And we can talk about it, put together a strategy for how you want to get this addressed. He said, that would be great, Dr. O'Brien. So we got all the student leaders in the room. This was before we started meeting with them on a regular basis. And to my surprise, some of the student leaders got mad at him. And they said, why did you do that to the president? Right? You didn't have to do it that way. And you know, there were some who were supporting him, but the reason why I raised that, and this is for response to Stephanie's question, is when you get the student leaders together, you realize that they don't all think the same, right? Just because they're a student leader, they're not all looking at the world the same way. And one of the things that I think can be most helpful for student leaders is to help them understand that different ways of looking at the world is healthy, and different understanding of how things work is healthy. But what you got to do is be willing to sit and talk about it and talk it through. And so the students sat and they talked about it, and they worked it out. And then they said, why don't we have a regular student org leader meeting? And that's when we started meeting every 2 weeks. And as we developed that over time, when this happened in 2020, we had been meeting with the students on a regular basis, student leaders on a regular basis. So when they wanted to meet to talk with the president, it wasn't a big deal to pull them together and talk about it and help them to strategize. And so that's how they were able to work it. So to Stephanie's question, you know, I tell students all the time, college is where you can make your mistakes. Out there in the real world, you'll pay a high price, you know. And I told that to the student leader that challenged the president. I said, you challenge the CEO of a company like that, the company you work at, you might not have that job for much longer, you know, or somebody will try to retaliate against you in some way, shape, or form. and it will be a totally different situation. I said, but in a college environment, it's an environment where you can do these kinds of things and learn from them. And the student that challenged the president, he took his lumps from his colleagues and changed his approach. He went on to graduate. He ended up going to Columbia Law School. He's a big-time lawyer in New York now. But the last time I talked to him, he said, you know, that incident and that situation, I learned about how I can approach leadership and power, you know? And so, to Stephanie's question, yeah, in the university session, you want to help them work through these issues so that they can see when they get out in the real world, you know, to know how to handle them.
Okay, very good. Excellent. Yeah. And very interesting question. I like that. Katie, one of our faculty members, asks, one of the emerging issues in social justice work is rejecting white dominant culture, example, traditional Cartesian philosophies and old school hierarchical leadership structures, and embracing the anti-colonial epistemology and practices. Do you have thoughts about how we can do that within the university and specifically in our courses?
Yeah. You know, when I joined Northeastern, I was in the political science department, and I used to teach a class called Urban Politics. And we're having a conversation. This was when George W. Bush was president. And we're having a conversation in class, and I'm realizing that only half of the class is really involved and half of the class is really engaged. And so I said, you know what? All of you all who are talking and engaged and all this, because it was a real heated political conversation, I said, I want to hear from some of the students that aren't talking. And they were being real quiet at first. And then one raised his hand and said, Professor O'Brien, he said, I'm a supporter of George Bush. He said, but I'm always concerned about raising it in class because I feel like I will get attacked. And one of the challenges that we have is if we are truly a country that believes in free speech and equity and fairness, that even if we disagree, we have to be comfortable enough with hearing people out, even in our disagreement. And so when we talk about things, and this is not the words that were used in the question, but when the issue of white supremacy comes up, right, it can cause all kinds of reactions out of people. And some people will even shut down where they don't even want to have a conversation. I think the challenge we're running into now is that the polarization is pushing people further away from talking to each other than bringing people closer together. And it's going to take some leaders that have the courage to be able to bring people together in the same room who have diametrically opposed views of the world and talk about it and figure out how we can come to some understanding that, you know, just like in political negotiations, you may not get everything you want, I may not get everything I want, but at least if we can find some things that we can agree on at some semblance of peace. You know, the challenge we have with the gun culture that has gotten so strong, I'm still not sure how this was able to happen in a country like ours. It's because people who live lives with guns in their lives and seem to be comfortable with it and, you know, don't have a problem with, you know, holding a gun and brandishing guns, never had the conversation with people who absolutely have no desire and absolutely hate guns and have a conversation about, okay, you have your guns, I don't have guns. How can we figure out how we can live in the same space without fearing something happening? And so it's gotten out of control now. right? It's gotten to the extreme. But hopefully, you know, you got to keep faith, because otherwise you'd lose sleep that someday and somehow this is going to change. But it has to start with people being willing to talk to each other, not yell at each other, or not accuse each other, or not blame each other, you know? And I don't know, I don't know the solution for it now. It seems like it was easier. Strangely enough, it seemed like it was easier to do in the 60s and what was going on then, right? With fire hoses and dogs being sicked on people. People seem to find a way to sit down and talk to each other. But now it feels like people can't even disagree without it getting carried out of control, you know? No.
Yeah, that's a good point. At one of after the George Floyd incident, after the murder of George Floyd, we had a lot of focus group discussions, and at one point I said, you know, the problem I'm having with these focus group discussions is that we all agree, we all know that something terrible happened and something needs to be done, but we're all of the same mindset. And I brought up an issue that you just raised, and I said, what would be wrong with inviting a white supremacist to one of the? I want him to be able to, without fear of anything, to be able to tell us, why does he believe what he believes, or she? Just so we can we come to some common ground? What common ground can we come to where we can finally decide that there's an approach? And it kind of fell on deaf ears, and people were like, well, we really don't want to hear from the white supremacists. Well, arguably, I don't want to hear from them either. I don't believe in what they're saying, but at the same time, I'd like to know what the mindset is, and we need to have a balance. So that's a great point, and we don't do a very good job of that, as we see in Congress. It's my way or the highway, and so that's where we live.
And you know, that's what was interesting in that class that I had, where the student raised his hand talking about George Bush. Several other people felt comfortable raising their hands too, right? And so after we finished the discussion, you know, I said to the class, I said, look, you're not going to be able to resolve all of your differences, but what you have to do is commit to at least trying,
right?
You know, or at minimum, respecting each other's views and each other's positions, and not turning it into something where you have to feel like you have to attack each other.
Right.
And the young man who originally raised his hand, he came up to me after class, and he said to me, he said, you know what, Dr. O'Brien, I have to tell you, I have never had this experience here at Northeastern. You know, every time I'm in these other classes, the conservative voice is squelched, is crushed. And I really appreciate you at least hearing us, you know, and allowing us to be able to share what we're thinking. And he stayed in touch with me for a couple of years afterwards. He went to work at the Red Sox, and he would email me about what he was doing. But the point is that sometimes it's those little things that you do that can have an impact. Now, he remembered that. He'll keep that with him, and I'm sure when things like this come up, he'll think about it differently, you know. And that's the value I think we have in these experiences with what I call the last stop before they go out into real world is college, right? And so being able to have that impact on them, you know, before they come.
Absolutely. Let me get to a question from, again, one of our very own, Teresa Good, who asks, I recently saw an acronym, DEIBJ, and I'm assuming obviously we know what DEI is, belonging is for B, and then J, I think, is for justice. While this is a symbolic first step, what suggestions do you have for someone looking for an entry point into the movement at a university, community, and on a social level?
Yeah, you know, we did a study years ago about community at Northeastern, finding community at Northeastern, and one of the interesting things that we found was the campus sort of broke up into three areas, right? You had students who were really active, always involved, always engaged. You have some who were involved in and out, you know, they were sort of on the fringes. But then there was this other group that sort of surprised everybody, that all they wanted was their degree. They didn't want to be involved. They did not want to be engaged, you know? And so as we support and work with students, and just like I talked about being involved with the civil rights movement, you want to get a sense of how much do students want to be involved and how much do they want to be engaged, and at what level do they want to be engaged, right? How much do they want to be out front, and how much do they want to be in the back? And the key is to talk to them, find out what it is that they want to do, and help plug them in where they feel most comfortable. You know, the thing that I really have a lot of pride in the last couple of years is our relationship with the LGBTQA Center, right? It's currently being directed by an African-American man, Kevin Vidiak, for the first time. But the reason why I bring it up is because when I took this job on, you know, let me take a step back. The Black community has had a different relationship, if I could use that term, with the LGBT community. It wasn't always embraced, you know, and particularly the Black church was, you know, very conservative in some of its views and the way it treated members of the LGBTQ community. And so when I took this job on, the Institute had some of that as part of its culture. Like, it wasn't willing to embrace the LGBTQ community. And I wanted to change that. And so I have been working hard to do that over the years. And so when Kevin has gotten hired, you know, I invite him, and he loves it all the time, to do events here in the Institute. As a matter of fact, he's probably done 5 or 6 in this past year, and where they hadn't done any before because they didn't feel like they would be comfortable here. And I thought that was important. And so being able to help to move the needle with regards to some of these cultural things, you know, I think is critical.
Fantastic. I'm glad you're doing that. And I'm glad that you're providing an opening. That's what really some of this is. It's an opening for people to feel like there's hope. They can be who they are. Yeah.
Yeah. And I always tell folks that we got to be an example of what we want the students to be, right? Right. If we want them to be more open and more engaged, then we have to be that way, because they see our example.
Good point. We don't have much more time, but I do want to get to a couple more if we can in the little time we have left. And Nancy Paulishin asks, again, one of our own, Nancy Paulishin says, agitation without innovation means complaints without ways forward, and innovation without orchestration means ideas without impact. From Stanford Social Media Review, September 18, 2017 issue, from an article entitled, Should You Agitate, Innovate, or Orchestrate? Richard, she asks, could you comment on this quote, especially in relation to why it took since 1968 for students at NU, at our university, to have some of their initiatives recognized?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'm going to steal that quote. Agitation without innovation.
It's a great article. It's a great article, Richard.
I'm gonna pull it up and take a look at it. You know, organizational culture is a really difficult thing, right? Especially when an institution like Northeastern gets so focused on its standing in the academic world, and you know, and being able to compete with the other top schools, and it becomes the focus and the priority. Well, I think what happened since 1968, because the university was pushing so hard for its growth and its advancement, that it felt like it couldn't pay attention to some of these issues, you know, and whether it was turned a blind eye to it, or, you know, just didn't feel it was a priority. But again, just like the equation of inertia and force, somebody has to make it clear no, you got to pay attention to this. You can't just ignore this, right? And continue on in the status quo. And so I would say that agitate, innovate, and orchestrate should all be done at the same time, right? Because you agitate is the spark, right? That's sitting down on the bus and refusing to get up like Rosa Parks did, right? And then all of a sudden it sparks a movement, right? And then people innovated. They said, well, we can put pressure on them by not getting on the buses at all, right? And that's what they did. And it nearly crippled the bus system.
Oh, yeah.
And then the orchestrate was the movement that came out as a result of that, right? They got together, they organized, and, we saw what the March on Washington ended up being. It's all of the above, what a wise man once told me, you don't have to swing at every pitch, but you want to make sure that the pitch you swing at is the one you gonna hit.
The home run.
Good one. I like that one. I like that one. Well, we are technically we are out of time, but yeah. Gunther has a question that I just feel like would be a good way to end this. And he says, one last question from my side. In your opinion, where are we now at Northeastern in regards to social justice and African Americans in class, compared with our peer universities? Have we met our goal? And I'm assuming he's asking where we are in terms of that goal, and are we doing well, or are we falling behind? Where are we in the process?
It's a work in progress. The president doing what he did, I shared it with some other universities and student groups and other administrators around the country, and they were fascinated that, one, the president was so detailed in what he committed to, but two, that he kept using the term anti-Blackness, right? That was something that even shocked us, right? When we saw the draft of it, we was like, wow, the president's saying anti-Black, right? Dealing with some of these issues on campus. But I would caution us, right? And we went through this a few years before Trump ran for office, right? When we did a straw poll on campus, and folks were shocked that Trump actually won the straw poll on campus. And the point being, yes, we've made progress, we can see it, we can feel it, but there's always that risk that there's something under the surface that we haven't dealt with that could rear its head at any time. And so the lesson that I learned, or we learned from that, was you got to be cautiously optimistic, right? You see the movement, you see the opportunities developing, but you got to be careful, because it doesn't mean that everything has gone away, and that something could pop up at any time.
Absolutely. Thank you. It just highlights the importance of this, and the discussion we just had altogether highlights the critical importance of this discussion, and the fact that I go back to what we talked about earlier, is that it takes leadership at all levels.
Yeah.
All levels, to create and bring change, and we see that in our classrooms as we work with our students, and many of them just walk away saying, "Wow, I never thought about this. I never thought about that." And that goes back to your point, Richard, in saying that, hey, look, diversity of thought, diversity of ideas. Once you bring it on the table, people will recognize that there are different ways of thinking. One of the things I'll end with here, I'll say, is that there's a group, a high school group that I met with not long ago. We talked, and one of the things they told me, I asked them about their school, and they said, one of the things we're forced to do, is in our debate, they have debate. Can you imagine? I thought that was something that was, hundreds of years ago, but they actually have debate classes, and what they are asked to do is take the opposing view and argue it and see if you can win the argument. And that's where we are. Take the opposite view, because you'll do the research, you'll check. You probably will not. And I would never change my mind about how I feel about the issue of social justice. But I will at least look at and see, this is why you think the way you do. Now let me see what I can do to convince you of my way. So the point is, that's the whole issue here is open-mindedness, and we need leaders to bring that to the forefront. So Richard, thank you for all you do for our university. Really, I'm serious about that. I think the Institute is a phenomenal place, and it sets the tone for who we are as a university. And I appreciate that President Aoun you have his ear. That's important. And I hope we can, number one, that you can share all of this with your students in our classroom, but more importantly, share it with us at a future date only, because I think we need to have more of these discussions on a regular basis. It's good for who we are. So thank you, Richard, for being here.
Thank you, Les. And thank you too, Teresa.
And thank you all for attending. We appreciate it.
I see you, Annalie. I see you. All right, take care,
Thank
everybody.
You all.
All right, bye-bye.
Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.